with no further delay from me, I want to welcome my dear friend, Prabhu Guptara.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be here with you this evening. The topic that's been given to me is the struggle for the soul of Europe. And you could apply that title really anywhere. You could talk about the struggle for the soul of America or the struggle for the soul of India. But as we're talking about Europe, we might look at those factors that are specific to Europe. And one of the questions that's often asked in America of me when I'm traveling here is there any hope for Europe? And in order to understand whether there is any hope for Europe, we need to understand how Europe got to where it is. So that's briefly what I'm going to be covering. How is it that Europe has gone from being the most Christian part of the world? We can argue whether being Christian is really the same as being a follower of Jesus. Obviously it's not. Nevertheless, it was the most Christian part of Europe, and it's gone to being the least. The most Christian part of the world has gone to being the least Christian part of the world. How come? What happened? What went wrong? You would expect that kind of cultural Christianity to have grown up, to have graduated into a real knowledge of Jesus. But actually it's gone the other way. And as you reflect on the story of Europe, you might want to reflect on the story of the United States. But let's start with the early history of Europe, and let's club it together into the period before the Reformation. So that's coming up to roughly the 16th century. This pre-Reformation part of Europe had universal feudalism. That means to say a particular way of organizing society in which, of course, the richest people lived a very luxurious life, and the poorest people basically survived, or perhaps did not even survive. So this universal feudalism combined in itself political, military, social, economic, and religious power. So if you were at the top, you represented all of these things together. And the very top, of course, of this was the Pope. But if you were not at the very top or somewhere near the top, then, in the words of the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who was writing in the 17th century in his book Leviathan, he put it this way: life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Leviathan, of course, was an argument why we needed centralized authoritative government, so he was not a Democrat. And nevertheless, in spite of not being a Democrat, what does he say? Where are his sympathies? Life for the ordinary person was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The reason he recommended authoritarianism, the reason why he liked the system of central control, was of course because it was a way of fighting against or resisting civil wars, resisting what he saw as barbarism, which otherwise arose in society. So that's a very brief, obviously, description of what life was like before the Reformation. Then comes the Reformation, the great bursting in, not, of course, complete, not perfect, not by a long shot, but a substantial breaking in of new life. Spiritual life, yes, but not only spiritual life. It was an explosion of literacy, because one of the big contention points, argument points between the Roman Church and the Reformers was, does everybody have the right to read? Guess who won? You are sitting here because the Reformers won. I like to say that the possibility for, I'm usually not speaking in churches or Christian organizations, I'm usually speaking in universities or in business organizations and so on. And in conversations with people, I often say, when they say they're atheists or agnostics, I say to them, your ability your right to be an atheist, your right to be an agnostic is because the Protestants won. People don't realize that. People think it's kind of natural to be an atheist or an agnostic. They don't realize that to be an atheist or an agnostic was something that would have cost you your life. Because till the Reformation, the religion of the ordinary person, whether the ordinary person was a king or a priest or whatever, depended on the religion of the king. If the king was Catholic, you were Catholic. If the king was Protestant, you were Protestant. If the king was Hindu, you were Hindu. If the king was Muslim, you were Muslim. Freedom of thought, the possibility of being an atheist or an agnostic or whatever else you want, really starts with the Reformation. But it wasn't just literacy, it was also knowledge, because you had not just the right to read, you had the duty to read. You had not just the duty to read, you had the duty to think for yourself. Come to your own conclusions, including the conclusion that you should be an atheist if you wish, or an agnostic if you wish. And of course, when people start thinking and coming to their own conclusions, people usually start having a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of strife. And the great contribution of the Reformation, even though it was not perfect, and there are all kinds of disasters we can point to, but broadly it made possible a culture in which you loved your enemies enough to enable democracy to work. Democracy is, of course, not a biblical idea. Democracy is a pagan idea. Nevertheless, the pagans could never make it work. And it's Reformation countries that enabled democracies to succeed because they created a culture in which not only was there thought and therefore disagreement, but a culture in which you had to love those who disagreed with you, love those who disagreed with you enough to be your political enemies. So Reformation is really what enabled democracy to exist. Reformation is, through its emphasis on reading and writing and thinking, what made the knowledge explosion possible, made science, modern science, possible. A whole lot there that we can unpack, and eventually, of course, made technology possible. The reason we are in this kind of building, rather than the quite primitive buildings that existed before the Reformation, is science and technology. The reason why you're sitting in the kinds of chairs you are, or I'm using this kind of equipment, is the impact of the Reformation. And the Reformation, by making possible the rule of law, which meant that the elite couldn't just steal what people produced, in making possible the idea that you had a responsibility for those who were poorer than you. It wasn't just something you should do to gain some merit to go to heaven, but it's something you do because it's godlike. And because it's godlike, you do it even if you have very little. If you have a lot, then you have much more responsibility to do good. In telling poor people that God wanted them to work because God is a worker. And the fact that you work and you produce wealth and this wealth is stolen from you is not a matter for you to start slacking. You still work hard even if the rich exploit you. You still work hard even if the rich steal what you produce. Because to work hard is godlike. So Europe rose from being the poorest part of the world, historically the poorest part of the world. Which were the richest parts of the world? Historically, which were the richest parts of the world? Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Iran and China and India. These were the rich parts of the world. These were the rich countries. On this continent, Latin America. So Europe went from being at least one of the poorest parts of the world in the 16th century to becoming, by the 18th century, as rich as Iraq and Iran and Syria and China and India, and by the 19th century it had become the richest part of the world. Now you know, of course, what happens when you become rich. Why do you need God? And when you're rich, then the temptation to simply enjoy yourself in whatever way you think is fit, golf or something else, is, of course, much greater. Nothing wrong with enjoying yourself, because God has given us life to enjoy, but God has also given us boundaries, and when you become rich, then it's very easy to want to buck these boundaries a little bit, isn't it? And that's what happened. If you want to understand why rationalism rose, why Darwinism rose, these things rose because the rich of Europe found in rationalism and Darwinism very convenient battering rams to break down the churches, to break down society. Because who's against you in a traditional society if you do something wrong? The people. Who's against you if you do something wrong in society? Whatever represents morality. And the churches, for all their corruption and all their incompetence, represented morality. So the rich started patronizing rationalists, started patronizing Darwinists, and so society turned increasingly towards rationalism and Darwinism rather than towards the wisdom of God, rather than to what had built up their societies from being the poorest parts of the world to becoming the richest part of the world. But as Europe rose from being the poorest part of the world to the richest part of the world, it became the example for the rest of the world, which wanted education, which wanted the rule of law, which wanted wealth, which wanted to be like Europe, on the one hand. On the other hand, as Europeans moved into technology, into factories, into manufacture, they needed bigger and bigger markets. And then using ethical means and unethical means, Europeans extended their rule around the world. So for good reasons and for bad reasons, European civilization began to spread around the world, a phenomenon that we now characterize as globalization. Along with the nasty things that went around the world were some very good things that went around the world, including organizations like the Red Cross, the YMCA, the YWCA, the Warsaw Convention against unethical warfare, the League of Nations, United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and so on. With each of these we can argue how good they were, what they did, and so on and so forth. But these were, civilizationally speaking, huge advances compared to what had been there before that. I, by the way, am a great critic of the United Nations. I'm a great critic of the World Trade Organization. If you read my writings, you'll find out all about where I think they've gone wrong. Nevertheless, in spite of all their deficiencies, they were civilizationally a huge step ahead. So what happened as a result of the globalization of the European experiment was that many good things were exported out of Europe and many bad things were exported out of Europe. Over time, it was not just technology that was exported, not just products that were exported, but also the ideologies of rationalism and Darwinism. And as this began to happen, then it was not just Europe that became post-Reformation or modern, evolutionist, Marxist, but it was these influences that then went around the world. Academic disciplines started being invented around the end of the 19th century, and these academic disciplines were marked by rationalism and Darwinism, so that these disciplines themselves became engines of ungodliness rather than godliness. If you want to understand why the great universities in the United States, the Ivy League universities, which were founded by the churches, were founded by people who were really believers, went from communicating the truth to communicating the kinds of things they're communicating today, you need to understand that rationalism and the rise of academic disciplines such as psychology or economics or whatever is thoroughly grounded on the wrong principles, on the wrong foundation. And so you go to university and you may lose your faith because you meet people who think faith is a funny, old-fashioned prejudice, superstition, or something like that. But you don't need to lose your faith in order to have your thinking destroyed. You can move from the wisdom of God to the foolishness of man by studying the great heights of the academic disciplines in the universities today. What started as an elite orientation in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, this kind of rationalism and Darwinism, became a bigger and bigger phenomenon as a result of the two world wars. And after that, as a result in the United States of the GI Bill, more and more people went and studied at universities, which were, of course, staffed by people who were not necessarily believers. Very few of them were believers. Mostly they were rationalists and Darwinists, Marxists, some of them. And so, of course, ungodliness spread through a population like that of the United States. And the interesting thing is that the more educated you were, generally speaking, the more ungodly you were. And this is why you have in the United States the strange phenomenon of a democratic country in which the majority of people believe in God. 78%, according to the last census, believe in God. More born-again people in this country, people who should know Jesus and walk with Him. How many of them do? Of course, we can argue and debate, but nevertheless, this country has more people who claim to know Jesus and walk with Him. How come your leaders are as ungodly as they are? It is because, of course, the leaders are the most educated. So you have a pyramid-shaped country in which the mass of believers are at the bottom and the leaders are the most educated and the most ungodly. Similar thing, of course, happened in Europe. It happened in Europe much earlier. So the hold and dissemination of ungodliness, rationalism, and Darwinism started in the United States only around 1930, whereas it started around, we can argue, 1860, 1870 in Europe. That half century plus has made all the difference between the culture of Europe and the culture of the United States. The United States is now beginning for the first time to share the kinds of issues that Europe has faced 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Not only because they started earlier, but also because society was smashed much more effectively, of course, by the two world wars. All the traditional structures of society were broken down as a result of World War I and World War II, and then, of course, that made it easier for the social bonds that hold traditions and so on together to not be there. So the phenomenon that you have in the United States, which has just started a decade ago, 2 decades ago, of the anti-theists, we have known in Europe for a long time. The situation that you have in the United States where the divisions of opinion are not just between followers of Jesus who may happen to be Democrat and followers of Jesus who may happen to be Republicans, but a situation where there's a clear line between those people who are for humanity, justice, decency, goodness, kindness, whatever, and those who are for the opposite. This is a recent phenomenon, as I say, in the United States. It has been known in Europe for a long time. So the struggle for the soul of Europe is a struggle between those who would like to move beyond rationalism and Darwinism into some kind of new age, into some kind of Eastern thought, whether it be Buddhist, Hindu, Jain, Guruistic, or whatever, because they find in these new religions something at least of warmth and light and hope beyond Darwinism and rationalism, Marxism. Because what we have in the West, throughout the West, whether it's Europe or the United States, is fragmented societies. Fragmented societies that are now frozen, cannot make progress. What's your economic growth rate? That's Europe's economic growth rate compared to China or compared to India. Economically, I exaggerate, it's not frozen. 2%, 3%, 4%, 5% is not bad, is it? But it's not 13% or 12% or 10%. Economically frozen, politically frozen. I don't need to tell you what's happening in terms of being politically frozen. And socially frozen. As the middle is stripped out of your society, which is what has happened economically, politically, and so on. As the middle is stripped out, more and more people graduate to the extremes, and as people graduate to the extremes, you either can be locked in a kind of very civil war, if you see what I mean, or you can be locked in a violent war. Thank God you are locked only in a civil war at the moment, if you see what I mean, rather than a violent war. We have known violent wars in Europe. We have also known quiet wars. So Europe is stuck between this kind of fragmented, stable kind of society, a society of stasis, such as you are now becoming some years after Europe got there. But the struggle for the soul of Europe is between materialism on the one hand, rationalism, Darwinism, Marxism, and so on the one hand, New Age type philosophies on the other hand, and the truth on the other hand. It is a struggle that is worth knowing a little bit about. The dominant society in Europe is still very much post-Reformation, but there are other values there, and there are value surveys, such as the Global Values Survey. If you don't know about it, do Google it. It's a very interesting objective analysis of what the values are in different parts of Europe, but not just in different parts of Europe, also in the United States, in China, in India, around the world. It's global, and you'll find it worth looking at. And as you look at this sort of map of values, which I've tried to describe in an impressionistic, historical kind of way, there are opportunities for bold, imaginative, and adequate answers, need for strategic thinking. It's good that we have outreaches of various sorts. You can look at what's happening around our campuses. You can see what's happening in the electronic media. You can see what's happening in the social media, very fascinating things. We could argue that they need to be done better. They need to be done differently if they're going to have more impact. Certainly you can argue that. But they are happening. At the very top levels, we have things like the national prayer breakfasts, which bring together people of all parties, people of all religions, people of all faiths and none, in order that they can pray together. The interesting thing is that in Europe, even atheists feel no problem about joining people for prayer. They may pray or they may not pray, but at least they are willing to give this kind of token respect. Then there are very specific means of reaching out to people in the elite. There are organizations like the Trinity Forum. Some of you perhaps may know about the Trinity Forum. If you don't, it's a very interesting way of reaching people who are thought leaders, enabling them to think about what it means to live a meaningful life. And the way they do it is very interesting. There's no preaching, there's no lectures and so on. It's done through groups, small groups of people, 24 to 32 usually, who meet together to discuss excerpts from the great writers, classics to the present, Bible, Quran, Gita, whatever. Very interesting. And there are curricula of readings on particular topics, and the particular topics can be science, technology, can be love, can be suffering, can be democracy, can be leadership, can be the 7 deadly sins. So there are all kinds of topics on which these people have combined, gathered these excerpts, put them together, and these binders of these excerpts become the curricula for these discussion groups. And the discussion groups can meet for a breakfast or coffee, or they can meet for 24 hours, or they can meet for 48 hours. They don't generally go longer than that. But they're a very fascinating group. You might want to look them up, the Trinity Forum. Then in the area of sports and culture, I find quite a lot happening in Europe. What I find missing in Europe, the areas that are not adequately addressed, are the arts and high culture. So if you look at our films, if you look at our music, if you look at, I don't mean popular music, but I mean classical music, today's classical music. If you look at our universities, if you look at our intellectuals, then you find that very little is being done. Journalists and mass media, very little is being done. So there are enormously encouraging things happening in Europe, and there are still areas of real discouragement. Europe has, in turn, trusted in rationalism, humanism, in social and political institutions, and now these social and political institutions are crumbling. While rationalism and humanism and Marxism have been shown to be hollow, in that they don't produce the values required to be sustainable themselves, let alone create societies that are sustainable, let alone societies that are environmentally sustainable. So there are all kinds of interesting things we can go into. The question is simply, as people relate to the issues in Europe, do we want to simply go in with simplistic notions, or do we want to see that everything, the riches of God's Word, are communicated to people? There are solutions to political problems that are given to us in the Bible. There are solutions to economic problems that are given to us in the Bible. The Bible could be a handbook for building a just, humane, global civilization. Unfortunately, that has been very little explored. But I'm grateful that people like Chuck are there in Europe, enabling individuals to come to know the Lord, yes, but also asking questions about politics and economics and society. How do we build up society? How do we take care of the environment as we should? How do we create a culture, beauty, in the way we should? Does music have to be really pretty close to noise? Does music have to be mindless? All kinds of interesting questions, but I'll stop because I think I've said enough. There is a struggle for the soul of Europe. Thank God for people who are enabling Europe to begin to look in the right direction. Thank you.